Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historian-Splaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. And this lecture will be Korea, Part 1, Dragons from Small Streams. And to give a sort of basic forecast of where things are with this podcast, I'm going to continue my repeating series like on the history of the United States in 100 objects. And I think that I'll start to circle in towards my actual area of greatest expertise, where my research was, where my degree technically is, which is early American history, and particularly American colonization and the Revolution. And in order to do that, I think I'll address some countries that are important and one has to know about in order to understand where American colonial civilization came from, including Ireland, which I haven't addressed specifically, possibly another on Scotland, and also Africa. But before I get into that, that might form its own kind of ongoing series. Before I get to that, I think I'll quickly address a couple of other countries that people have asked about a lot, and that would be interesting to examine maybe once or twice. And those are firstly Korea and also Italy. So I've talked before about the beginnings of important major civilizations in Asia, specifically India and China. And I also posted one lecture, a sort of broad survey on Japan up until World War I. That was part of my series on the origins of World War I, and I just released it for the public a few weeks ago. And Korea is another country that is very interesting because it can kind of get lost in the cracks. When we think about Asia, it can be overshadowed, right, by other larger countries like India and Japan. And yet at the same time, it also looms very large. People think about Korean music, popular culture. It's sort of taking the world by storm in some ways, as some have pointed out, in the same kind of way that America did 50, 60 years ago. So I'm going to talk about Korea, and also people have asked about Italy, which was the next major country to enter into World War I after it had already begun in 1914. And it's also a complex, interesting story about state building and nationalism. So I think I'll try to have at least one on Italy in time for the 110th anniversary of their engagement in World War I. But now I want to cover Korea before we move away from Asia again for a while. And Korea, not only is it, as I said, very much in the awareness of popular culture and media, it also came into the news recently, and specifically its history of struggles against dictatorship and between authoritarian and democratic forms of government. And Korea is very interesting as a distinct society, really in the middle of East Asia, always influenced and to some degree overshadowed by more powerful states on either side, to the east, to the west, and even to the north with Russia. Koreans have customarily called their country, quote, a shrimp among whales. So there is Japan to the east, which occupied and colonized Korea for many years. And then perhaps even more significantly looming to the west is China. And Korea is one of the few countries on earth where you can talk about China being in the West. But that's how it is from this vantage point. A lot of Korean history has been about the balance and the interplay between distinct local customs and institutions and borrowings from China, which is the great social, cultural, and political hegemon of East Asia. And it's often been seen as a kind of secondary state within the Chinese sphere of influence. Yet at the same time, like Venice, which I talked about in my previous multi-part series, like Venice, it was able to maintain its sovereignty and independence for over 1,000 years, and even through a very similar time period, from late antiquity up until the 19th century. But Korea maintained its sovereignty and independence using very different strategies. Monarchical centralization rather than republican governance and separation of powers like in Venice, and very often through isolation rather than through trade and expansion. And Korea's geography, in a way, is even more conducive to isolation, even than the islands in the Venetian lagoon, which the Venetians used as launching pads for trade and colonization abroad. But to look at the geography of Korea, it is a large peninsula extending southward from Northeast Asia about 600 miles into the Pacific. To the north, there are mountains, steppes, and forests of Eastern Asia, including of Manchuria and Siberia. To the west is the Yellow Sea, and beyond it, the northern plains of China. To the east is the Sea of Japan, or East Sea, and beyond it, the island of Honshu, the main largest island of Japan. To the south is the Korea Strait, which is a wide sea channel connecting together the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the Sea of Japan. Southeast of the southern tip of Korea is the Japanese island of Kyushu, and to the southwest, just over 50 miles from the mainland, is the large volcanic island of Jeju, which is about 700 square miles in area and has long been inhabited by Koreans and considered part of Korea. So looking at the peninsula in general, its terrain is very mountainous. While the mountains in most parts of the country are not very high, just a few thousand feet, they are ubiquitous. There are only very small patches of coastal or alluvial plain in Korea, and there is no place that one can stand anywhere in Korea where mountains are not in view. Nearly every city, town, or village has hiking paths leading off into the mountains. Mountains have always been central to the Korean cosmological worldview and way of life. There's a long-standing ancient belief in the divinity of mountains as spiritual beings, providing protection and abundance. Mountaintops are seen as gateways between the earthly world and the heavens or the spiritual realm, and as places for visions and spiritual enlightenment. In every Buddhist temple or shamanistic shrine, even in the lower valleys, one will see figures of the mountain spirit or deity called Sanshin, who is depicted as an old man or woman with a tiger and a red pine tree. Many towns and villages have specially dedicated shrines or altars to the local form of Sanshin called the Sanshingak, and these serve as sites of local ceremonies called Sanshinje. The position, shape, and terrain of Korea also make it naturally isolated, even more so than many large islands, like if you were to compare it to Cuba or Great Britain or Madagascar. And while the British have sometimes bragged about their splendid isolation from the continent, Korea has really been more so, and one has to look more specifically at the geography and terrain in detail to understand how. So if one starts from the north, taking that as our vantage point, as if approaching Korea from the Manchurian plain and moving southward into the peninsula, which is in fact how most early migrants, it seems, entered into Korea, one would first have to climb a very high mountain range called the Changbai. And at the heart of this range, one would find the summit of the enormous mountain, a stratovolcano called Mount Paektu, the summit of which rises to just over 9,000 feet in elevation, punctuated by an enormous crater or caldera over 3 miles wide, and which is mostly filled in by a crater lake called Heaven Lake. Mount Paektu is an active volcano. The current crater was created by an enormous eruption in 946 AD. It seems one of the biggest eruptions in known history. And it has erupted several times since then, most recently in 1903. In fact, its next eruption is overdue and could conceivably start any day. Flowing outward from the slopes of Mount Paektu are 3 rivers: the Songhwa, which flows northward into the Manchurian plain, the Tumen, which flows eastward down to the Sea of Japan, and the Yalu, which flows westward down to the Yellow Sea. So together, the Tumen running eastward from the volcano and the Yalu flowing westward form a kind of natural boundary, separating Korea from the mainland of Eurasia. Now, if we continue then south down from Mount Paektu, the terrain continues to be very complex and rugged. Immediately below the volcano, one finds a broad, high plateau called the Kema Plateau. And then 3 mountain ranges extend outward from the Kema Plateau. To the west, the Gangnam; to the east, the Hamgyong; and to the south, the long Ki-Baek mountain range, which is by far the longest. And it runs hundreds of miles down along the eastern spine of the peninsula, close to the eastern coast. From the Ki-Baek Mountains to the east, the land drops precipitously down to a very straight coastline with hardly any bays or inlets, and then plunges down into very deep sea waters in the Sea of Japan. There are hardly any coastal plains except for a very small area of flat land in the northeast around a small notch in the coastline, and there are no significant river mouths. Now, to the west, the high Ki-Baek Mountains drop off very gradually from east to west, sloping down into lower branching mountain ranges, foothills, and narrow winding valleys. Eventually, one reaches a very complex, convoluted western coastline, totally unlike the eastern coast, with many small bays, inlets, and thousands of small islands scattered all around the southwestern and southern shores. So one can see overall rugged mountains and high rivers tend to cut off Korea from the mainland of the continent in the north. And it might seem as if the extensive coastlines ought to provide the possibility of contact and trade with other lands by sea. But in fact, this has not generally been so because of the nature of these coastlines. The eastern coast, as we saw, has no good natural harbors, and regardless, it is cut off from the rest of the country by the high mountains. The western coast, on the other hand, should have many good harbors, but the waters here are very shallow, with many shoals, reefs, and mudflats, and it has very dramatic tides, among the biggest in the world, close almost to those of the Bay of Fundy, and these cause powerful tidal currents and whirlpools, such that all in all, the seas can only be navigated by the most skilled and specialized mariners, and even then it is extremely difficult and dangerous. So really the only good shorelines for seafaring are in the far south, where there are usable harbors along the Korea Strait. And indeed, southern Korea, especially south-central Korea, has been the main portal of contact between mainland Asia and Japan. And it's mainly been the states that have controlled this southern shore of Korea that have benefited to some degree from seaborne trade. But nonetheless, Korea has been able to grow and thrive regardless, because the land and climate of the peninsula can support a large population, and Koreans have been able to take advantage of the landscapes for self-sufficiency. As in Japan, the seas provide a great deal of food, including fish, shellfish, and seaweed, and there are abundant natural food sources on land, especially due to the climate. So if we look at the climate of Korea, overall, the peninsula is very wet and humid, especially in the summers, with moisture and frequent rains brought to the peninsula by the monsoon winds. There are then comparatively drier autumns and winters, but this varies, of course, between the north and the south. So the climate is wettest of all in the south, with long, warm, rainy summers and short winters. And the climate, especially along the southern coast, can be called humid subtropical. The central areas and the high mountains are more humid continental, with somewhat shorter summers and cold winters with occasional snow. The north then is very continental, with short summers and long, bitterly cold winters, blasted by cold winds blowing down from the Eurasian steppes and the Siberian forests. So most of the hills and mountains in Korea are forested with many wild animals and wild plants providing foods like acorns, chestnuts, millet, and roots like turnips and garlic. And the very wet climate with heavy rain and snowmelt means that there are many streams and rivers, despite the narrowness of the peninsula. So apart from the Yalu and the Tumen rivers in the north, as one moves down southward through the peninsula, one crosses numerous large rivers, most of them flowing from east to west, from the Ki-Baek Mountains down to the Yellow Sea. The most important of these include the Taedong in north-central Korea, flowing from the lower mountains in the northeastern part of the peninsula down to the northwestern seacoast, the Han in south-central Korea with many tributaries running from the Ki-Baeks and joining together just before flowing into the Yellow Sea, the Geum River, which runs in an arching pathway through the southwestern part of Korea, and the Naktong River, which is the only large river in Korea that flows southward from the southern part of the Ki-Baek Mountains down into the Korea Strait near the southeastern corner of the peninsula. These rivers, like the seas, also provide fish, and in the lower river valleys there are alluvial plains, among the only flat lands in the whole peninsula. They are very fertile, with rich alluvial soils and silt from the mountains and forests. These low river valleys are especially conducive to rice cultivation, with the rice growing abundantly in the wet summers and ripening in the dry autumns. And this has been practiced, it seems, since antiquity and can support large populations, and most of the large cities in Korea have been located near the mouths of these major rivers. Firstly, Pyongyang, whose name originally means flat land, and that's in the lower valley of the Taedong River in the northwestern part of the country. Seoul, or Seoul, as it's called by English speakers, which is on the lower Han River, and Busan, the main city of the south coast, which is by the mouth of the Naktung. But these cities only formed after thousands of years of development and evolution within Korea, and for a very long time, Korea was very sparsely populated, and urban life came here much later than in other places like China or India or the Near East. And this is again largely because Korea was so isolated. Many important inventions like metalworking and irrigation that have spurred on civilization came relatively late to Korea and arrived in a kind of rapid, delayed succession, where in other countries they had emerged more gradually, spaced thousands of years apart. So how did first human beings and then civilization come to Korea? Well, this is quite difficult to reconstruct as compared to other places we've talked about, for several reasons. One is that writing only came fairly late to Korea. There are no surviving writings from Korea itself until thousands of years after it was used in China. There are Korean chronicles about the origins of Korean civilization that were written much later, after 1000 AD, and it's not clear how much the details in these chronicles are reliable. There are also some contemporary reports and remarks about Korea in ancient Chinese records, but they are brief, sketchy, and also often unreliable. One can also draw, of course, from archaeology, which is very important in Korea, but there are large gaps here, and it is very hard to piece together a full picture, because for one thing, Korea is so rugged and mountainous, and it's heavily forested with a very wet climate. And the lowlands, even where they are flat and cleared, are intensively farmed and populated and have been for centuries. So a lot of ancient material has been destroyed by the actions of nature or human action, and what might be left behind is hard to locate or uncover. There are no big ruins just waiting to be excavated, like in the deserts of Egypt or Pakistan. And so a lot of the early history has to be inferred from small finds of tools or pottery or occasionally building foundations. So all of that being said, what can we say about the beginnings of human life and civilization in Korea? Well, it seems that humans first came into the peninsula during the last ice age, or the Pleistocene era, when Korea, unlike most of Northeast Asia, Korea was not covered in glaciers. It's very hard to say when humans first came in. Some estimate about 30,000 years ago, but this is very uncertain. And it seems that the earliest people in the peninsula lived largely in caves and sometimes built simple porticos over the entranceways of the caves that they inhabited. They mainly clustered along the seacoasts, suggesting that they lived largely by fishing. And they did leave behind stone fish hooks and weights for fishing nets and big shell middens. It seems they also hunted and gathered on the land, and they found plenty of abundant food there, enough that with time they did not have to live nomadically, but could settle in place and collect food. And in these places they started to build more freestanding houses, largely simple wood and thatch structures with sunken floors dug into the earth. A technology that did appear relatively early in Korea was pottery. So by about 7,000 years BC, people in Korea were making large jars and pots, which are useful for storing up food, like especially fish, and not so useful for traveling and migrating. So it was useful in their more settled lifestyle. The earliest pottery in Korea is called comware. It was decorated with sets of incised parallel lines in a style very similar to pottery found across northern Eurasia, including Manchuria, Siberia, and even Scandinavia. And this suggests that the early migrants into Korea may have come from that area of sort of interior northern Eurasia. Then, before about 1000 BC, a new pottery style also appeared, which was plain and undecorated. And this may represent a new migration into Korea from the mainland, partly displacing the older population, but there probably also was a lot of intermingling. It's clear that around this time, by 1000 BC or so, different early migrations melded together and came to form a distinct population in the isolated environment of the peninsula, with broadly shared customs and with relatively little connection to the mainland. And this is reflected crucially in two ways. The first and most important is the Korean language. So it seems that the Korean language goes back to ancestral roots and predecessors in ancient times within Korea. Korean is a language isolate. It is not definitely related to any other known language on Earth. The one exception being Jeju, the language spoken on that large island in the Strait of Korea, which is distinct but clearly very close to Korean. But putting Jeju aside, Korean is sui generis. It belongs to its own unique language family. It has a completely unique sound system, which is very hard to master or even understand for foreigners. And, I'm going to make approximations here in this lecture based on what I've read and heard in videos, but I'm sure it will not be exactly right. It's just an approximation. Korean has a very unusual syntax, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And as for the vocabulary, in modern Korean, about half, maybe even more than half of the words are borrowings from Chinese, including a lot of technical words. But if one looks at the more common everyday vocabulary, those are native Korean words, and they are also completely unique and cannot be matched up to cognates in any other language. Now, that being said, some have theorized that Korean may be genetically connected and have some distant common ancestor in common with some other languages, such as Japanese or other languages from Central Asia, mainly based on some similarities in the syntax. And so some linguists have argued that Korean can be grouped into the broader Altaic language family, this umbrella group that includes Turkic languages like Turkish and Uzbek, Mongolic languages like Mongolian and Oirat, and Tungusic languages such as Manchu and other languages spoken in northern China and Siberia. Now, the reasons for this are that Korean has certain distinctive features and structures. It is agglutinative, meaning it tends to build words by taking a word stem and adding on suffixes and prefixes, but especially suffixes. And in this way, it's similar, for example, to Turkish. And as for the sentence structure in Korean, it is subject, object, verb. So, one does not say, I ate lunch, but I lunch ate, right? So that's a bit unusual, and that too is like many Altaic languages. So it seems to make sense, matching this up with the archaeological evidence, it seems to make sense to suppose that Korean might ultimately derive from some Central Asian root that connects it to these Altaic languages. But others have argued that these are only fairly broad similarities, and the same sorts of features are actually shared by many languages around the world. And even apart from that, many linguists have challenged the whole idea of the Altaic language family and argued that these are just broad commonalities among Asian languages that probably come from prolonged contact and exchange, but do not necessarily mean there's a genetic relationship or shared ancestor. If so, then Korean too might just have some similarities from early contact with Central Asia, but the language itself actually formed separately within Korea. Now, secondly, the local distinctiveness and independence, you could say, of Korea is also underscored in its mythology, and specifically in its main founding myth. So Koreans traditionally trace their descent from a mythic progenitor called Tangun. And according to the earliest surviving version of the story, which is in a chronicle from the 1200s, but it might date back to earlier than that, according to this story, in the distant past, thousands of years ago, the supreme heavenly god Hwanin had a son named Hwanung, and Hwanung wished to descend to earth and live among the humans. So his father gave to Hwanung 3 seals to govern the people, and picked out a high mountain for him to dwell upon and help the mortal people. So Hwanung descended along with 3,000 followers, a kind of heavenly host, and picked out a spot under a tree near a holy altar and set up a heavenly city there. With his seals, he took charge of the winds and the rain and of many spheres of human life, including agriculture, ethics, and justice. 2 animals, a tiger and a bear, saw all that Hwanung was doing for humankind, and they wished to become human themselves. So they approached Hwanung and asked to be transformed. And in response, Hwanung gave to each of them a bundle of mugwort and garlic, and told them to go into a cave out of the sun and stay inside for 100 days, eating only those herbs he had given to them. The tiger didn't have the patience and gave up after not very long. But the bear remained in the cave for longer and in time transformed into a woman. She then came out into the light to live as a human. But she could not find a husband, and she prayed at an altar to have a child. So Hwanung took on a human form and lay with her, and she conceived a child, who was born sometime later and was named Tangun. Tangun then grew up to become the founder of the first kingdom in Korea. And he is seen as kind of the ancestral and founding figure, and it's believed that he inaugurated the kingdom on October 3rd, which then is still celebrated today in Korea as the National Foundation Day. So to look at the meanings and implications of this myth, this progenitor figure of Tangun, who's born of a bear woman, emphasizes the local origins of the Korean people, who arose, it seems, in situ from the mountains, caves, and forests of the country itself. And then Hwanung's descent from heaven, it again shows the central importance of the mountains, right, as the place of connection between the different realms. And it can also be seen to symbolize the rapid appearance of civilization in Korea, which happened within the peninsula, introduced in a sense from the heavens, not from another land. Now, regardless of this mythological narrative, it seems that after the introduction of settled collecting and pottery, new technologies and new lifeways followed very rapidly. So the people began colonizing more up into the uplands, relying more on hunting and eventually also on agriculture, rather than just on fishing along the coasts. Larger clusters and groupings of houses appeared, forming early villages. Around 3,500 BC, it seems plant cultivation began, starting with millet. And that was a native species within Korea, and it had a somewhat limited effect. Millet was not so extremely productive in the climate and terrain of the peninsula, but it was followed later by soybeans and red beans, and around 3000 BC, the domestication of animals. And this, it seems, began with Hanwoo cattle, the native mountain cattle of Korea, and then that was followed by pigs, chickens, and dogs. Much later, around 1300 BC, it seems that the cultivation of rice began, and this was evidently introduced from China. It's very mysterious exactly how this happened. It's hard to tell when rice grains found in middens were cultivated as opposed to gathered, or where or how they were cultivated. There are no good archaeological remains from the farm fields of this early period, mainly just stashes of seeds. And it seems it took a long time for rice cultivation to spread and become common in the peninsula. But eventually it reached the south, where it grows better in the wetter, warmer climate. Through the centuries, more scythes and grinding stones appeared, and rice became a larger part of the diet. And it clearly was the major basic food source by about 800 BC, but was still combined with hunting, gathering, and fishing. Rice cultivation probably started with dry rice cultivation in fields cleared by slash and burn. Then sometime later comes wet rice cultivation, with fields and paddies systematically flooded with water from reservoirs. And the rivers and low hillsides among the mountains are very conducive for this. But it's hard to say when it began, since those valleys have now been intensively cultivated continuously for millennia. And it seems that the growth in wet rice cultivation was then spurred on by metal tools. So in about the 800s and 900s BC, there was the introduction of bronze working, and it came into Korea from the northern steppes and forests. It starts with imported articles like knives, weapons, and horse trappings from Central Asia and Siberia, and then later also objects like vessels from China. Then forges and workshops were established within Korea, and it seems their techniques followed the Scytho-Siberian style. So this is a distinct style that comes down from Siberia and Central Asia and is different from the styles and techniques in China. These Korean bronze workers apparently made mainly ceremonial objects like daggers, bells, and hand mirrors. And these mirrors, it seems, were circular with geometric or spiral patterns on the back, while the reflective front is made with a zinc alloy textured with fine engraved lines. And it seems they were either held in the hand or maybe worn around the neck to reflect the sun, and they might have been part of shamanic sun worship. Also, with time, Korean metalworkers began making weapons and armor. And this helped to fuel then the growth of a warrior elite, especially in the north, with significant power. Between about 1300 BC, the northerners built thousands of so-called dolmen, large tombs built from boulders and monoliths assembled on bare hilltops with great expense of labor. And it seems that warrior chieftains were buried in these dolmens with ceremonial stone weapons. Around 300 BC, ironworking was introduced from China. And like in China, ironworking in Korea was used some for weaponry, but more so for tools, including agricultural tools like hoes and plowshares, and also building tools, which then enabled the construction of larger dwellings, temples, and fortification walls, largely built out of brick and rammed earth. This then, it seems, led to the formation of local or tribal statelets, often centering on a fortified town. These tribal or small town societies had ruling classes of warriors and of shamans and visionaries. The warrior elite, it seems, was especially important in the north, with a great deal of warfare and raiding being carried out among these tribes and statelets, whereas the shaman rulers were more important in the south. They also had many peasant villagers and significant numbers of slaves, especially taken from conquered or defeated tribes, and usually held by the warrior elite, and sometimes, such as in the north, sometimes sacrificed to be interred with their masters or rulers after they died. Now, starting around 400 BC or so, the political landscape of Korea started to consolidate into a set of larger regional or confederated states. And this happened probably largely because the peninsula was under increasing pressure from the Chinese in the west and from a very aggressive, warlike, nomadic confederation called the Xiongnu in the north, on the northern steppes. So these small tribal states in Korea began to band together and coalesce into regional confederations in order to defend their territories and resources against encroachment, and also to try to manage and benefit from trade with the foreigners. And these confederated states tended to have elected leaders, called by various names, meaning prince or lord, etc. And when relating with China, which now was, the big hegemon that they actually made contact and had communication with, when relating with China, they tended to take a subordinate or vassal role, where they would have to acknowledge the Chinese emperor as their overlord, or even pay symbolic tribute in order to then trade with China. But as they grew stronger with the mastery of ironworking and horsemanship and with wealth from trade, some leaders of these confederated states began using the title of Wang, which is a Chinese term basically meaning king. And thus they effectively declared themselves as sovereign and independent on an equal footing with the Chinese rulers. And this process, it seems, began in the far north and the northwest, where tribes were the most exposed to the foreign powers, including the Xiongnu and the Chinese. Now, during China's Warring States period in the 400s to 200s BC, many Chinese people, probably including merchants, scribes, petty officials, emigrated in order to escape the violence and instability. And you might remember when we talked about China, there was this sort of class of traveling shi officials and bureaucrats who sort of would move around from state to state looking for posts. Well, some of these sorts of emigres from China resettled in the small towns and outposts in Korea, especially in the northwest, along the upper Yellow Sea coast. and they began to act as go-betweens and emissaries to manage trade between China and the small states along the coast of Korea. Now, as of the 300s BC, the Chinese state of Yen, which was one of the 7 warring states, occupied the northeastern part of what had been China. And the Yen began to expand through Liaodong in the coast of what's now Manchuria, all the way eastward up to the Yalu River, right on the edge of the Korean peninsula. So by about the mid-300s BC, it seems that statelets in northwestern Korea on the Yellow Sea coast and the Taedong River Valley consolidated together and formed a regional state called Joseon. And more specifically, this early state tends to traditionally be called Go-Joseon, meaning old or ancient Joseon, in order to distinguish it from later kingdoms and dynasties that used the same name. But we'll get to those later. But basically, it seems Old Joseon took shape in the northwestern part of peninsula, controlling land between the Taedong River Valley in present-day North Korea westward to the Liao River in Manchuria. And they effectively blocked the expansion of the Yen state into Korea. They fought border wars around the Liao River in Manchuria and were able to basically hold their own. Now, according to much later chronicles, Go-Joseon was supposedly originally formed and founded by a Chinese prince named Gija from the Shang dynasty, who fled the fall of the Shang, went east to Korea, and founded this new state, and supposedly brought technologies with him like ironworking. And hence, this early state is sometimes also called Gija Joseon, the kingdom founded by Gija. Now, this myth is very doubtful, and it would put the formation of the state all the way back into the 1000s BC, when the Shang dynasty was overthrown, and hence long before the appearance of any metalworking in Korea. And ancient Chinese texts, like the Analects, do actually speak of this Prince Gija, but they do not mention him emigrating to Korea. Later Chinese books, like the records of the Grand Historian, do say that he went east to Korea and brought arts like agriculture and silk making with him. But this, is a convenient story for the Chinese to sort of take credit for the civilization of Korea. More likely, this is a later myth that arose that serves to symbolize the important role of later Chinese immigrants and refugees in bringing customs and technologies from China into Korea, and in a way helping to pave the way for the formation of Joseon. When we look at this early state, there is an ambiguity still in the ruling elite and exactly who they were. They may have been largely immigrants from China, that is what was traditionally thought, or they may have been locals who simply adopted Chinese customs, or it may have been a mixed elite with elements of both. But regardless, this new confederation took advantage of its position to manage trade with China. Korea exported a great deal of lumber, fish, and salt westward to China, and Joseon became prosperous, with tombs of the ruling elite showing wealth and many Chinese-made goods, including gold, jade, bronze, and lacquerware. And Joseon experienced a period of flourishing and wide influence, benefiting from this period of relative weakness and disunity in China. Now, this began to change closer to the later 200s BC. So as you may remember, China was unified under Qin Shi Huangdi, who conquered the Yen state in 222 BC, and then proceeded to attack the borderlands again, advancing the Chinese frontiers eastward, but then stopped and formed a fortified border with outposts near the Yalu River. So for a short time at least, as Qin was in power in China, Joseon, it seems, accepted this adjusted border, and they benefited from trade during a brief period of peace and stability in China. And they made a pledge to recognize Chinese overlordship and pay obeisance to the emperor. But they never followed through on this. They also agreed to disavow the royal title of Wang, but they still continued to use it internally. So there's a sort of ambiguous, unstable situation here. After 210 BC, the Qin dynasty collapsed in a wave of mutinies and rebellions in China, and the chaos and instability continued for decades until eventually the Han dynasty was able to consolidate power and restore order and unity. And Chosun, it seems, took advantage also of this period of instability by pressing again on the northwestern frontier and retaking some territory from the Chinese. Additionally, this period of chaos led to another wave of emigration from China to Korea. And eventually, the Chinese migrants in Korea found a leader in the person of a general named Wei-man in Chinese, or Wei-man in Korean. So he was a military commander who had been in the service of the Yen state. And he may have been Chinese in origin, or possibly he might have been a mercenary originally from Korea. This is uncertain. But regardless, he was displaced in the chaotic changeover from the Qin to the Han. And reportedly in 195 BC, he left the Yen state along with a retinue of 1,000 followers and went east into Joseon. And on this journey, he reportedly wore the customary Korean-style white clothing, which by this time the Chinese now recognized as sort of the distinctive dress of Korea. And he wore his hair tied into a top knot in the Korean style. And hence some have theorized he may have himself been Korean and was sort of returning home, or he was Chinese and simply wanted to present himself as conforming to Korean ways. Probably he also brought with him more current Chinese knowledge and technology, and with his large retinue, which must have included many fighters, he was clearly a threat to Joseon. So King Jun of Joseon appointed Wei-man as a military governor to fortify and defend the frontier region in the northwest against the Chinese. And this was maybe a way to sort of make use of him and also keep him at arm's length, giving him something to do on the frontier. But from here, it seems Wei-man began to build up his own base of power, including among other Chinese immigrants and among local magnates who had ties to China. In 194 BC, he staged a coup and seized control of Joseon, overthrowing King Jun, who then fled southward into the tribal areas of southern Korea. After this coup, the Chinese agreed to recognize Wei-man as a vassal ruler of Joseon, sort of semi-independent but recognizing Chinese suzerainty. And they did so on the condition that Wei-man allow envoys from other barbarian states around Korea to travel through his territory to China to offer homage to the Chinese emperor. So in effect, he was acceptable as long as he recognized China as the ultimate center of civilization and did not try to conquer or expand beyond the territory of Joseon. Wei-man ruled Joseon until 180 BC, and he was succeeded by his son and grandson. And the kingdom benefited from even closer trade and diplomatic contacts with China, and continued to manage trade between China and the far-flung peoples. These included the so-called Han tribes of the southern peninsula, and also Central Asian peoples to the north, including the Xiongnu. A few decades later, in the late 100s BC, Han China became increasingly concerned by the rising power and prosperity of Joseon. And the Emperor Wu was especially concerned that they might ally together with China's archenemy, the Xiongnu, who were to the north, and with whom Joseon had extensive contact. In 109 BC, King Uge, the grandson of Wei-man, broke the agreement with China and began to block foreign envoys from the smaller outlying tribes from traveling to China. So in effect, he was kind of trying to seize regional power and hegemony from China. So Emperor Wu sent an envoy named Shehe to Joseon to rebuke the king, and Uge sent him away with a Korean envoy to escort him back to China. On the way, Shehe killed this Korean escort. Subsequently, Uge had Shehe apprehended and executed. And this sort of exchange of assassinations, you could say, provided the pretext for war. In 109 to 108 BC, the Emperor Wu sent repeated Chinese expeditions to invade and conquer Joseon, both by land and by sea. Evidently, these different forces on land and sea did not coordinate well, and they underestimated their enemy. Joseon was able to confront them and pick them off separately one by one. Finally, in 108 BC, the Chinese reached the capital, besieged the city, which eventually surrendered. And the Chinese sent assassins who tracked down and killed King Uge. the kingdom of Chosun fell and was destroyed by the Chinese. So China then sent in troops to fortify and incorporate Chosun into the empire, and moreover, they laid claim to almost the entire peninsula of Korea. They divided the peninsula into 4 so-called commanderies or provincial districts around the peninsula, each one with a garrisoned provincial capital, and each one then subdivided into smaller prefectures. But these commanderies were immediately embattled. The frontier prefectures are repeatedly roiled with rebellions and with attacks by surrounding tribes, statelets, and confederations. 26 years after the conquest, around 82 BC, 2 of the commanderies were abolished and completely abandoned, and another was moved northward to the upper Yalu River, closer to China. So the Chinese had to dramatically retrench, and only 1 commandery effectively remained within the peninsula. It was called Lelang or Nangnang in Korean, and it was based in the northwestern part of the peninsula in the plains of the Taedong River Valley, basically the same area that had been the heartland of Chosun. And the capital was on the Taedong River near the site of present-day Pyongyang, which in the name of that city basically means the flat land, right? Because it's there in those alluvial plains along the river. So this Lelang commandery controlled the northwestern quarter of the peninsula and some of the central area. The Chinese censuses say that it had about 400,000 people in 60,000 households. So it's a pretty good population, especially for what the Chinese saw as an outlying, frontier district. The capital near Pyongyang was prosperous and even opulent, with the Chinese colonial elite building splendid palaces and tombs and importing fine artworks from China proper. Lelang lasted for almost 400 years. It had a massive advantage in technology and resources over the Korean neighbors. But despite this big advantage, they were never able to advance much beyond that limited territory, nor to reestablish control over the rest of the peninsula. They were eventually able to expand somewhat to the south, and eventually around 200 AD, the southern reaches of Lelang were separated off to make another commandery called Taifang. But other than that, it was really a holding pattern for several hundred years until the Chinese colony was eventually overwhelmed and conquered. So how did this happen? How did it happen that China failed to conquer all of Korea and eventually the Chinese colony fell? Well, one has to look at what was happening in the rest of the peninsula and nearby lands and at these other regional confederations that took shape. So these other regional confederations began, as we mentioned, firstly in the far north, where nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes began to band together. And the main threat here, again, at least at first, was the Xiongnu. So around the 400s BC, a statelet began to form called Puye, and it comprised several tribes and chiefdoms in the uplands of present-day Manchuria, north of the Yalu River, who joined together into a confederation called Puye. And they included some farming and shepherding peoples, and they chose a leader who was called the Ka, presumably like the Mongolic title Khan. And since their main enemy was the Xiongnu, and the Xiongnu were the great threat to China, naturally the Puye reached out and made an alliance with China. And this Chinese alliance defined Puye for the rest of their history. This new formation of Puye and their alliance with China then in turn created a new threat to other tribes and chiefdoms further south, around the Yalu River Valley and the Kema Plateau. And these were largely nomadic or semi-nomadic masters of horsemanship who relied on hunting, shepherding, and raiding. And by about 400 or so BC, they saw the encroachment by the Chinese from the west and by the Chinese allies, the Puye, from the north. And so around the 300s BC, the tribes in this area also banded together and formed another confederation called probably Goguryeo. And this, you might notice, is the ultimate root of this modern term Korea. But in modern times, we call this confederation usually Goguryeo, meaning, again, old or ancient Goguryeo. And the original tribes probably included some breakaway groups from the Puye who migrated southward. But whereas Puya is Chinese-aligned, Goguryeo is staunchly anti-Chinese. And they will, in the following century or two, come to eclipse the Puya and become the largest state in the region. They are then the main force that the Chinese colony in Korea will have to contend with, and that will eventually destroy them. And apparently Goguryeo starts off initially as a fairly typical tribal confederation, with 5 main constitutive tribes, each one with a large warrior ruling class and many slaves. The nobles of these tribes, it seemed, were trained in groups apart from their families in the arts of archery and mounted warfare, and they were instilled with a martial ethos and esprit de corps, much like one sees among the Mongols or much like in ancient Sparta, which had a similar training system. Their leaders are chosen from among the tribal elites by some sort of election, and the decisions like war and peace are usually made by consensus among the 5 tribes. The region that Goguryeo occupies is mostly rugged, without great lands for farming, and the Confederation is not even self-sufficient in terms of food. So for survival, they depend on warfare, raiding, and the requisitioning of tribute. They do accumulate some degree of wealth, although not comparable to Joseon, and they are known as martial, and their status comes from warfare and control over labor forces. And this is reflected in their leaders' stone and earthen tombs, which are generally different from the dolmen. They're more dug into earthen mounds, and they are laden with simple bronze and stone grave goods, and also elaborate wall paintings showing dragons, animals, and scenes of warfare and domestic life with both men and women. And it seems that their artworks and clothing styles are most similar still to Central Asia, more so than to China. And Goguryeo was able to hold its own, and moreover, to the north, it eventually overwhelmed and absorbed the remnants of Puya. To the south, they're able to keep Joseon in check, and to the west, they hold off the Chinese on their western border. To the east, Goguryeo effectively defeats the large fishing tribes along the eastern coast, such as the Ye and the Okcha, reducing them to tributary vassals. But still, the real problem for Goguryeo arises to the south, after the Chinese conquer Joseon and make it into a Chinese colony, and hence are able to combine their advantageous strategic position with the greater resources of the Chinese Empire. And this new threat apparently spurs on a series of reforms, where Goguryeo becomes more of a centralized kingdom with permanent bases of power. Now, according to later chronicles, which record traditional stories and dates, the traditional date of the founding of the first capital of Goguryeo is 37 BC. And this first capital was called Jolbon. Its site is uncertain. It was probably near Woo-Keun mountain, just north of the Yalu River in present-day Manchuria. But in later years, the capital was moved several times, further and further south, down into the Korean peninsula, as their northern rivals were defeated or pacified, and as the Chinese commandery at Lelang became the main threat that had to be confronted. In the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, a series of centralizing reforms were enacted. Under the long-reigning monarch Taejo, who reportedly ruled for almost 100 years, from the 1st into the 2nd centuries, reforms were enacted including the switch over to a hereditary dynasty rather than elective, with one tribe being designated to supply all of the kings, and another designated to supply the queens, to marry the brides of these kings. But even still, there was a continuing separation of powers. The kings were mainly military commanders. Supreme religious duties were given over to specialized shamans, and civil governance, it seems, was entrusted to a sort of chief minister called the Taedero, who was still elected. So you see here in Goguryeo a kind of hybrid between a kingdom and a confederation, sort of like the Holy Roman Empire. And Goguryeo repeatedly tried to attack westward into the Chinese-held province of Liaoning, presumably trying to cut off the link and supply lines between China and the Chinese commandery at Lelang in order to isolate Lelang and make it easier to defeat. But they were generally rebuffed. In 209 AD, a Chinese commander attacked Goguryeo took some territory and forced Goguryeo to withdraw the capital eastward away from the border. Now, finally, Goguryeo see a major opportunity after 220 AD, when the Han dynasty in China fell and China again split, this time into 3 kingdoms. So the Chinese state of Wei, based in northern China, retained control of the colony in Korea. And this becomes the first major turning point when tribes and states all around the peninsula then saw a chance to push back against a comparatively smaller and more weakened Chinese state. And one might have expected that Goguryeo now would quickly rush in, capitalize on this opportunity, and seize the Chinese commandery at Lulang, and perhaps even take the smaller one at Taifang in the south as well. But it turned out to be not so simple, for several reasons. For one, the Goguryeo underestimated the state of Wei, and capturing Lulang was not so easy as they had expected. Secondly, also, as they did eventually move southward, they encountered a new rising power further to the south, which had previously been very disunited, but which then quickly rose to challenge Goguryeo. So hence, the fall of Chinese power in Korea did not simply lead to the domination of Goguryeo, but rather it led to an age of feuding and intense contests for power within Korea, which has been called the Three Kingdoms era. And I'll get into that when we get there. But, you can imagine whenever you have 3 kingdoms on the board, there's going to be a lot of drama and feuding and backstabbing, and it's really great stuff. So we'll get to that in a moment. But how does this happen? Well, in the 220s and 30s, Goguryeo firstly again sought to get along with this new state of Wei, at least for the time being. And they cooperated with them, for one thing, to defeat and sweep out enemy strongholds of other tribes along the northern frontier in Manchuria. But then, once that was done, in 242, the Goguryeo king Dongchun decided that the time was right, and he turned against Wei. And he sought to capture the Chinese fortresses along the western border, again to cut off the Chinese colony in Korea from the rest of China. In 244, the Wei state sent a massive expedition to counterattack. It inflicted enormous defeats upon Goguryeo and destroyed the capital. The Goguryeo king Dongchun had to flee eastward and take shelter for a time among the Okja on the eastern coast. Then Goguryeo gradually regrouped. They were never a very urbanized society. They were highly mobile. As I said, they relied on hunting and raiding. And they were able to basically withdraw again into the mountains and then regroup, relying on natural resources to rebuild their strength. In 259, the Wei invaded again, but this time were massively defeated by a highly trained Goguryeo force of about 5,000 cavalry. Goguryeo then rebuilt their kingdom and built a new capital at Hwando. In 313, the king Michan launched an offensive that finally conquered the main Chinese commandery of Lulang, and they occupied the main town, again, basically at the site of Pyongyang. The Chinese power in Korea had now completely collapsed, and the Goguryeo were now undisputably the main power on the peninsula. But they were not able to rest on their laurels and enjoy this victory for long. While they were focusing on consolidating their control over the newly conquered lands to the south, they started to be attacked and harassed by a new Central Asian confederacy called the Xianbei. In 342, the Xianbei attacked and destroyed the capital at Hwando, and the queen was taken prisoner. Soon after, they also suffered attacks coming from the south, these from the newly emerging state of Baekje. In 369, Goguryeo attempted to attack and invade Baekje, but they failed, and Baekje then counterattacked in turn. In 371, the Goguryeo king Woo-Keun was killed in battle by Baekje forces, and the city of Pyongyang was lost and fell to Baekje. And this then was another turning point, which led to a pivotal time of reform and retrenchment. But now, to understand how this happened, we have to then look at the other side of the story. What was going on to the south of the Chinese colony, in the whole southern end of the peninsula? Well, if we look at the South during the period of Chinese colonization, so in this era, there were fishing tribes living along the eastern coasts, such as the Ye and the Okcha that we've mentioned. But then further south, basically below the Han River, there was a scattering of many small tribes and statelets living in narrow river valleys or on coastal inlets. And these also were collectively called Han as a kind of general umbrella term, probably after the river. It has no relation, it seems, to the Chinese dynasty. There can be confusion there. But these Han tribes were described as living in villages with sunken thatched houses, growing rice and barley and raising pigs, and were said to be very fond of drinking and dancing, and celebrated large festivals throughout the calendar year. It seems that in these tribes, the shamanic sacerdotal elite was very powerful and ruled, in a sense, alongside the kings and chieftains. Most towns had a sacred enclosure called the Sodo with a tall ceremonial pole and ritual implements like drums and bells. And this enclosure was under the control of the shaman. It was the site of ceremonies and also was a kind of sanctuary where fugitives, foreigners, etc. could take shelter at the pleasure of the shaman. The Han tribes tended to cluster into three broad regions, in the southwest, the south central area, and the southeast, based on sort of local affinities like dialect or trade relations, marital relations. But during the era of Chinese colonization, they remained only very loosely associated, never forming a strong confederation or even alliances. And this was largely the result of Chinese strategy. So the Chinese policy, it seems, was to co-opt the local Han elites, giving out special titles and diplomatic distinctions to tribal chieftains, which they then sealed with bronze medals and tokens. And China in this way presented itself as the main font of status and prestige, and kept itself as the central hub of power and diplomacy, with the smaller tribes and towns just forming sort of spokes on a wheel. And this could then keep local rulers competing with one another for status and better trading privileges, rather than banding together. And this is a fairly typical strategy for an imperial hegemon to keep frontier tribal societies neutered and pacified. And the Han tribes were able to prosper to some degree from exporting raw materials to China through Lelang, and these included salt and eventually iron, which came to be mined from deposits along the southern and eastern coasts, and which was in very high demand in China. But it happened that both salt and iron were considered imperial monopolies in China. And hence the Chinese at Lelang requisitioned a lot of those materials as tribute, and hence the wealth and development of these tribes was very limited and curtailed. Nonetheless, some of these societies also started to benefit from seaborne trade. They have, as we said, the best harbors and launching points for boats to China and even more so to Japan. And tribes and villages in south-central Korea especially had close contact with the early state of Wa in Japan, and it seems even introduced ironworking to the Japanese islands. And these tribes in the south-central area did start to form a very loose association called Kaya, which grew very wealthy and even opulent, but they never banded together into a new state. Rather, it seems the first real confederation to form in the south was in the southwest, around the Han River Valley, just south of the Chinese colony, and it was called Baekje. And according to traditional histories and chronicles, it was founded by a combination of local Han tribes and migrants from the north, including from Lelang and Goguryeo. And the founding royal dynasty, it seems, claimed to be originally from Puya, far in the north. And this may or may not be true, but it suggests that the founders were taking inspiration from the older confederations to the north and were maybe drawing on that sort of warrior legacy associated with the north. They reportedly founded a capital called Wiryaseong on the Han River, basically close to the site of Seoul, the modern-day capital of South Korea. The traditional date of the founding of this confederation is 18 BC, But again, it's almost certainly not really that early. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that it was not until much later, more like around 200 AD. But this is a very controversial statement, and these different putative dates for the founding of these different confederations are very much disputed and a matter of controversy today, because they've been pulled into sort of power and status contests between North Korea and South Korea, right? Each state kind of wants to claim the legacy and to be the successor of the oldest original state in Korea. But we don't have exact enough records to know exactly when these things happened. And it just seems from other evidence that Baekje formed a bit later, maybe around 200 AD. Their expansion and consolidation was slow, but they could capitalize on great agricultural productivity, a large population, and strong trade, including with China and Japan. And eventually they managed to consolidate the whole southwestern quarter of the peninsula. After the Han Dynasty in China fell in 221 AD, King Koi of Baekje sought to take advantage, and he strove to centralize and mobilize Baekje. In about 250 AD, they achieved a major victory against the Chinese and became the major power controlling most of southwestern Korea. In 313 AD, as we saw, Pyongyang in the north fell to Goguryeo. And again, Baekje sought to take advantage of this power vacuum as the Chinese colony collapsed. So from 314 AD onward through the mid-300s, they advanced northward, conquering much of the land that had been the Taifeng commandery. Now, the big problem, of course, now was Goguryeo. This was their serious, powerful neighbor directly to the north. And it was a rising power, not a declining state like Han China. So for a time, Baekje had to retrench, and they cultivated trade relations with China, bringing in new technologies like writing, and also with Japan, and it seems they sent their first diplomatic mission to Japan in 367. Then they went on the offensive again, under the expansionist king Gunchogo, who ruled from 346 to 375. In 371, they invaded northward and won a massive victory over Goguryeo, taking Pyongyang. The king Woo-Keun of Goguryeo was killed in battle, and this was the first major triumph for Baekje, but it also turned out to be a turning point, again as we saw, leading into a new era of reform, which in time would cause the tide to turn against Baekje. So this reforming era began in Goguryeo. So following right after their massive defeat in 371, Goguryeo did not want to take this failure and loss of Pyongyang to Baekje lying down. So after the king Goguryeo was killed, he was succeeded by Sosurim, who was determined to reverse this loss. And he evidently perceived this new rising upstart power of Baekje as having benefited from closer contacts with China. And China at this time had developed a whole complex system of administration, justice, and military and governmental training. It was the home of the largest professional bureaucracy anywhere in the world and of the best trained military officer corps. And you might know, China in the Warring States period had been the home of Sun Tzu, the foremost analyst of warfare in the world, and still seen as an authority on war today. So Sosurim adjudged that Goguryeo needed to import more of this knowledge and expertise from China in order to catch up and push back against Baekje. In 372, just the year after he came to the throne, Sosurim founded a Confucian Academy, or Taehek, which could serve as a portal and a way to import not only ethical teachings and philosophy, but also techniques of administration like tax collection, land management, and census taking. Sosurim promulgated the first single standard law code in Goguryeo, and he also embraced Buddhism, this new philosophy that by that time was ascendant in China, and he sponsored the building of Buddhist temples. And he probably saw this as a way, for one thing, of building closer relations with China. And also, it could provide a unifying belief system that transcended tribal practices and loyalties and fostered greater cohesion and a sense of shared mission in Goguryeo. Now, this reform program in Goguryeo was then followed in Baekje as well. In 384, Baekje brought in a Buddhist monk from India into the court, and the royal dynasty embraced this new faith and sponsored the building of temples and pagodas. The new belief system served as a conduit for high culture, including art and literature, from China into Baekje. In the early 500s, Baekje further sent emissaries and missionaries to spread Buddhism in Japan, reinforcing the close links between southern Korea and Japan. But meanwhile, Baekje and Goguryeo were still enemies on the battlefield all along. In the mid-370s, Goguryeo went again on the offensive against Baekje, but they did not get very far and then had to retrench again and hold off against attacks coming from the north, from the Khitan, another Central Asian power. King Soserim died in 384, and under his successor Goguryeo, Goguryeo again went on the offensive. They attacked the Yen in northeastern China in 385, and then Baekje in 386, but it was fairly unproductive and they did not gain much territory. Then King Goguryeo came to the throne in 391, and in the 390s, the kingdom struck out again in both directions, to the north and the south. In the north, they were able to venture far into the Asian interior, defeating major tribes like the Khitan and the Sushen. In the south, they waged a series of wars against Baekje, which successfully conquered southward, retaking Pyongyang, and then advanced further south, taking the Han River Valley, including the site of modern-day Seoul. They forced Baekje to abandon their capital and withdraw southward, and the power of Baekje now was much reduced and continued to decline. In 400 AD, Baekje found that they could not beat Goguryeo, and so they turned instead eastward and tried to consolidate control of the southeast. They formed a coalition together with the smaller neighboring confederation on the south coast called the Kaya and with the state of Wa in Japan. And together this coalition attacked the small kingdom of Silla in the southeastern corner of Korea. So Silla at this point was still a fairly small and relatively isolated kingdom formed among tribes in the southeast, but it would later become very important, and we'll talk about them more later. But Silla, under attack and sort of surrounded from multiple sides, reached out to Goguryeo for help. And Goguryeo was able to defeat this whole coalition of Baekje, Kaya, and Wa. And in return, Silla gave their fealty to Goguryeo as a vassal state. So now Koguryeo's star continued to rise. In 413, the king Goguryeo died and was succeeded by Jangsu, who reigned for an extraordinary 78 years, from 413 to 491. And under this very long, stable reign of Jangsu, Goguryeo reoriented again to the south. In 427, they moved their capital down to Pyongyang. Jangsu built great monuments, such as a tomb for his late father, Goguryeo, and erected a stele engraved with accounts of his reign, written in classical Chinese. And this is a very important monument. It is still today the largest engraved stele in the world, and it's the first surviving extended text composed in Korea. And it shows growing knowledge and learning in Korea, including in classical Chinese, which is a skill that Korea would come to pride itself in. Diplomatically, Goguryeo was able to hold off the Chinese by playing off contending regional states in China against each other. In Central Asia, they made further advances against some powerful tribes like the Khitans, but then established peace with them and began to consolidate their gains and stabilize these far-flung frontiers. To the south, Goguryeo maintained peace for several decades, but then resumed their aggression against Baekje. In 472, Baekje, with their backs, you could say, against the wall, their ruler sent letters to the Chinese state of Wei, complaining that Goguryeo was blocking Baekje's attempts to send emissaries to China. And this was very provocative because it signified that Goguryeo was trying to usurp China's primacy in the region. And thus, in effect, it was an invitation for Wei to come and attack Goguryeo. But King Jangsu of Goguryeo found out about this message. Maybe it was intercepted before it reached China. And so, with this knowledge, Jiangsu first sent a Buddhist monk down to Baekje to act as a spy and prepare the way for an attack. In 475, Jiangsu sent in an invasionary force which captured and destroyed the capital of Baekje, and the king of Baekje was killed. His successors were then forced to withdraw even farther south into the southern mountains for safety, and Baekje was reduced more or less to a rump state, which had to lick its wounds. Goguryeo at this point entered into a golden period in the late 400s to early 500s, when it controlled 3/4 of the Korean peninsula, as well as land and trade routes far into Manchuria and Siberia, and even as far as Mongolia. So how did Baekje respond to this defeat? Well, with further retrenchment, as we saw, they retreated far down into the southern highlands, and with a fanatical recommitment to the state doctrine of Buddhism. In 599, a very devout king came to the throne who banned all killing of humans and animals, including hunting and the slaughter of domestic animals. He ruled for only 1 year and may have been killed by his own opposition. It's uncertain. But in a way, this sort of episode is not uncommon. One can see this sometimes in states that are in severe crisis. A kind of act or movement of penance can be put forward to try to halt the erosion of political power. But secondly, after this sort of reaffirmation of Buddhist doctrine, Baekje underwent a diplomatic realignment, now making an alliance with Silla, that small state in the southeast, in order to try to hold off and counter the rise of Goguryeo. Now, Silla ends up becoming the third major player in Korea, and their emergence would lead to a long quasi-stalemate with shifting alliances, and this period from the late 400s to the 600s is called the Three Kingdoms era. So who was Silla, and where did they come from? Well, they were a relative latecomer to this power game. They are traditionally said to have been founded in 57 BC by a leader who was born miraculously from an egg laid by a white horse. Now, this story and this date is probably not accurate. It seems that, again, it formed gradually a bit later, perhaps starting in the 100s AD. And it started off as a confederation of 3 powerful local clans called the Pak, the Sok, and the Kim. And the crown, it seems, rotated among these 3 main clans. The rulers were called by titles basically meaning shaman or priest, and it seems they had a quasi-shamanic role. They wore ceremonial antler crowns, much like shamans, and they had limited power, which they shared with several other institutions. And those included a periodic council or parliament of noble families, which made decisions on war and peace and the succession, and also a core of young unmarried men who were called hwarang or flower boys. And this was an initiated group recruited from the upper class young men and trained to be archer warriors and later to serve as military officers and servants of state. And it seems the hwarang practiced rites from native shamanism, later also combined with Buddhism. The society was divided into a caste system called bone ranks, with the noble clans at the top. In the late 300s, the Silla changed over to a hereditary monarchy and built a capital at Saro, and their rulers began to use the title of king. But their shamanic beliefs and traditions still had great power and were tied closely to the monarchy. The rulers for a very long time opposed the spread of Buddhism, and Silla became the major holdout for indigenous shamanism against the rise of Buddhism. In 433, they made an alliance with Baekje, which lasted for over 100 years, and this enabled them to gain a foothold as the main power in the southeast of Korea. They expelled or killed Buddhist missionaries until finally in 527, the ruler embraced the Buddhist faith. Over the course of the 500s, the kingdom gradually centralized, such as by promulgating a standard law code based on the Chinese template. And they emerged as a new major power, benefiting from their very defensible position, with mountains forming a kind of natural fortress, and from their gradual, slow expansion westward, as they bit by bit conquered towns and tribes in the smaller Kaya Confederation on the south central coast, which were very wealthy from trade, including with Japan, but had not been well unified or defended. So Silla was the state that ended up taking advantage of that vulnerability. So with the incorporation of Kaya, Silla also became very wealthy. In 551, Silla and Baekje, in alliance, went to war together against Goguryeo. And together they defeated Goguryeo and gained a great deal of territory, including most importantly the rich and fertile Han River Valley. And the supposed plan was that they would split the valley then between them. But Silla then double-crossed Baekje and surprise attacked the mostly exhausted Baekje troops. The king of Baekje was killed, and Silla seized all the newly gained territory, including the Han Valley. So Silla was now the principal premier power on the southern part of the peninsula. And Silla again stood out as a holdout against Chinese practices and lifeways. This would eventually change when the balance of power shifted in the following decades. So how did this system of shifting alliances and attacks and betrayals among these three kingdoms, how did this eventually lead to unification? Well, all of this wrangling was going on among the three kingdoms while China continued to be weak and divided. But this changed in 589, when the new Sui dynasty came to power and reunified China. And they first dealt with pacifying Turkic tribes far to the west, but then they turned to Korea. So in 596, the Sui emperor contacted Goguryeo, which he saw as their main threat and obstacle in the east. And the emperor demanded submission to him as overlord. Goguryeo refused formal submission and instead sent raids to the Chinese borders and also sent emissaries far to the west to make alliances with the Turkic Khanates. In 598, the first Sui emperor then sent an enormous invasionary force into Goguryeo, again by both land and sea. But they were hampered by heavy rains and stormy seas and had to turn back. In 612, the second Sui emperor sent another invasionary force, supposedly, according to chronicles, comprising over 1 million men, and taking 40 days in total to depart from Beijing. The emperor himself, furthermore, went along in command of this army. They had to cross high rivers, flooding with meltwater while under attack by Goguryeo away teams. They sent a large army detachment and naval squadron to besiege and attack Pyongyang. And this force massively outnumbered the Koreans, but the city was well fortified, and they were reportedly lured into a series of traps where they were cornered and decimated by Goguryeo warriors. So the besieging force had to withdraw, and Goguryeo pursued and harassed them as they retreated through Manchuria, and all in all the Chinese forces were decimated. It was a massive catastrophe for the Sui regime. But the emperor still launched 2 more invasions in 613 and 614. But this campaign could not be sustained with long, vulnerable supply lines and then further with unrest within China, and both attacks failed. And there were huge losses of lives and resources that helped then to touch off revolts and mutinies around China. In 618, the Sui emperor was assassinated by a general, and the Sui dynasty fell and was replaced by the new Tang dynasty. So through all of this, Goguryeo had not only held off massive power from China, but had in a sense brought the empire down. The Tang dynasty then took some time to regroup, and they also again fought to pacify the Turkic tribes in the west and had a great deal of success. And later in the 640s, they launched another series of invasions of Goguryeo, which then again also failed, partly due to their failure to deal with very harsh winters. But the next Tang emperor launched more failed attacks in 655 and 658. So you can see Goguryeo has become kind of a black hole here for Chinese lives and resources. Now, meanwhile, as that struggle is going on in the north, in the south, Silla and Baekje are relatively sheltered from this Chinese aggression, which the Goguryeo are conveniently holding off for them. But they're still at one another's throats, wrangling over territory in the south. And in 642, Baekje was able to seize border forts from Silla. So Silla then starts looking outward for allies. And in 647, Queen Jindok came to the throne in Silla in the midst of this conflict. And she appointed her relative named Kim Chunchu as her chief diplomat, and she dispatched him to foreign courts. He went to Japan and also several times to China. And Kim and the Queen Jindok were able to woo the Tang court in China, doing things like mastering Chinese and composing poetry in Chinese in the emperor's honor. They also persuaded the Silla court at home to adopt Chinese dress and the Chinese administrative bureaucracy. In 654, the queen died without heirs, and the council then chose Kim as the next king, inaugurating a sort of new dynasty. And Kim then sealed an alliance with Tang China, and an understanding was reached that China would help Silla to defeat Baekje if Silla would help China to defeat Goguryeo. So in 660, Silla and China jointly attacked Baekje by land and sea and quickly conquered the kingdom. They then immediately pivoted northward and launched a pincer attack, with Silla attacking Goguryeo from the south and the Chinese invading from the north. But they were premature. The people of Baekje had not given up yet. Some diehards escaped and went abroad and found allies in Japan. These then joined forces with resistors and rebels within Baekje and tried to retake the kingdom. So Silla and China were only finally able to defeat them and pacify the southwest in 663. So now Silla and Goguryeo were the only powers remaining on the peninsula, and one was aligned with China and the other against them. So the Goguryeo really only barely escaped this pincer attack by the skin of their teeth, and they knew that they were still in deep trouble. They were in danger of defeat if attacked again from both sides. So the king of Goguryeo died in 666, and immediately after the confederation fell into dissension, with some leaders struggling over control of the throne, and some simply seeing the writing on the wall and defecting to the other side. These defectors then helped to guide another invasion. So in 668, Tang and Silla armies again began to invade from both directions, and they quickly defeated the outnumbered Goguryeo armies. In October of that year, the Tang armies besieged and captured Pyongyang. In 669, the Tang dynasty set up a so-called protectorate general to pacify the East. The Chinese love these sort of grandiose and kind of Orwellian titles, but they set up this protectorate general, which then occupied most of the captured Goguryeo and Baekje territory, and they expelled or displaced many of the local people in those countries. Now, Silla, naturally, was furious. They believed that they had been robbed of the territorial gains that they ought to get from their part in the victory, and they feared now that they might be attacked and occupied next. So they then cut off the flow of supplies that they had been providing to the Chinese troops, and the Chinese now again had to struggle with very long supply lines. In the north, the people of Goguryeo began a series of revolts against the Tang occupation, and Silla then aided these rebels in the north. And furthermore, fighters and resistors from all over the peninsula began to rally to the banner of Silla, even though they had just been their enemies a matter of months earlier. They began to rally to the banner of Silla as the sort of symbol of resistance against Chinese rule in Korea. In 671, Silla retook control of most of Baekje with some help from allies on the ground. In 675, the Tang attacked Silla head-on and defeated them. But shortly after, the Tang emperor had to withdraw troops out of Korea to fight in escalating wars with Tibet, far to the southwest. So Silla then relaunched their resistance and attacks against the Tang. In 676, China sent a fleet across the Yellow Sea to reoccupy Korea, but they were intercepted and defeated. And naturally part of this was that these are very difficult waters to navigate, and the Korean fleets knew better how to maneuver in them. Silla then launched a series of attacks which retook all of the peninsula south of the Taedong River. So the Chinese Protectorate General was forced to withdraw north and westward into Liaoning. The two powers then formed a truce and recognized a border basically along the Taedong. Decades later, in 736, Tang China finally formally accepted Silla's sovereignty over all of Korea below the border. In other words, in about 3/4 of the Korean peninsula. So one now had in place for the first time a single unified kingdom under a single dynasty, ruling over most of Korea as a formally sovereign independent state. And this was a dynastic state with its roots in Silla, but that had conquered most of the peninsula and secured its independence from China through a joint campaign supported by all different regions of Korea. It now also had a single law code and administration, more or less based on the Chinese model, and a new blended belief system that combined Buddhism with native shamanic traditions. And this more or less would be the foundation of the state that would then rule Korea for more than 1,000 years thereafter, and in which the country and the nation that we think of today basically took shape. And hopefully we will get to that soon, but at this point I'd like to thank my patrons. And again, since we are coming up to April, I'd like to thank all of my current active patrons who first signed up in the month of April. And it happens that this podcast was started in the month of April a number of years ago, more than I'd like to mention. But first and foremost, I will thank my current patrons who were the first to sign up all the way back when this podcast was launched and who are still contributing today. And those are Carl Biachetti and the very first patron who signed up and is still contributing, John Sullivan. And the others I would like to thank are Susan Marsh, Karen Plaschutznig, June, Peter Goldstein, Eric Daffron, Spencer, Adam Hustler, Evan Hafely, Ray, Richie Cunningham, Vasu, Zachary Talbot, Susan Lewis, Dave R., Mike Gallagher, Brendan Tobin, Nathaniel Webb, Ira Rosenberg, Narki, Kelsey, Ross Girk, Anu Srivastava, Jose Benitez, and Jim Elowich. Thank you.